In 1867 Arizona Territory, 16-year-old Mercy watched in horror as her desperate master bartered her life away for a single barrel of Kentucky whiskey until a humble pastor stepped forward with every cent he owned to challenge the transaction. But when the buyer returned with legal papers proving he already owned her, would anyone be willing to risk everything to save a girl the law considered nothing more than property? The sound of breaking glass cut through the smoky air like a knife through butter. Mercy pressed her back against the cold wooden wall of Murphy's saloon, her heart beating so fast she thought it might jump right out of her chest. Through the dirty window, she could see her master Jacob Henley throwing his cards down on the table, his face red as a tomato. The autumn wind of 1867 whistled through the cracks in the walls of Tombstone, Arizona Territory, carrying dust and the smell of horses from the street outside. Mercy clutched her small cloth bag tighter, feeling the few things inside that belonged to her. A carved wooden bird her mama had made before she died, an old picture of her family, and the little Bible that Pastor Reynolds had given her when she could finally read all the words. "I ain't got no more money," Henley shouted at the men sitting around the card table. His voice was thick and slow from too much whiskey. "But I got something else that's worth plenty." Mercy's stomach dropped like a stone in deep water. She knew that tone in his voice. It was the same voice he used when he sold his horse last month, or when he traded his good boots for a bottle of rum. It was his selling voice. The other men at the table leaned forward like hungry wolves. There was Pete Murphy, who owned the saloon, with his big belly hanging over his belt. Next to him sat Carlos Martinez, a man who bought and sold things, horses, cattle, and sometimes people. And across from Henley was a stranger Mercy had never seen before, a tall man with silver hair and eyes as cold as winter morning. "What you got, Henley?" Pete asked, spitting into a cup beside his chair. Henley wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and looked toward the window where Mercy was hiding. For just a second, their eyes met through the glass, and Mercy saw something she had never seen before in his face. Fear, real deep fear that made her own chest feel tight. "I got a girl," Henley said, his voice getting quieter. "She's strong, smart too, can read and write better than most folks in this town. She can cook, clean, keep books, do numbers. She's worth more than anything I ever owned." The wooden bird in Mercy's bag suddenly felt as heavy as a rock. Her mama had carved it when Mercy was just little, back when they lived on the plantation in Georgia before the war ended. "This bird's gonna fly free someday," her mama had whispered, putting it in Mercy's small hands. "Just like you will, baby girl." But now, sitting outside this dirty saloon, Mercy didn't feel like she would ever fly free. She felt like a trapped animal waiting to see what the hunters would do next. The stranger with the silver hair spoke for the first time. His voice was smooth like honey, but there was something mean underneath it. "How old is this girl?" 16, maybe 17. Lost track after her mama died of the fever 2 winters back. Henley shuffled his feet like a little boy who knew he was in trouble. "She'd been with me since I bought her from the plantation when it went under." Mercy's hands started shaking. She had been with Henley for 3 years now, ever since Master Johnson lost everything and had to sell all his slaves before the war ended, and freed them all anyway. Henley wasn't the worst master she could have had. He never hit her unless he was real drunk, and he let her go to church on Sundays. But he also never let her forget that she belonged to him, like his horse or his saddle. "I want to see her," the silver-haired man said. "She's right outside," Henley replied, standing up so fast his chair fell backward. "Mercy, get in here, girl." Mercy's legs felt like water, but she knew better than to keep Henley waiting when he used that voice. She walked around to the front of the saloon, her bare feet silent on the wooden porch. The saloon doors swung open with a creak that sounded like crying. Inside, the air was thick with smoke from cigars and the smell of unwashed men. The floor was sticky under her feet, covered with spilled drinks and things she didn't want to think about. She kept her eyes down, looking at the pattern of dirt and stains on the wooden boards. "Look up, girl," the stranger commanded. Mercy raised her head slowly. The man's eyes were the color of ice on a frozen pond, and they looked at her like she was a horse he might buy. He walked around her slowly, and Mercy felt her skin crawl like bugs were walking on her arms. "She's skinny," he said finally. "She's strong, though," Henley said quickly. "Watch this. Mercy, show him how you can lift that barrel over there." Mercy looked at the whiskey barrel sitting by the bar. It was nearly as tall as she was, and probably weighed more than she did. But she had learned long ago that it was easier to do what Henley said than to argue. She wrapped her arms around the barrel and lifted with all her strength. Her muscles screamed, but she managed to pick it up and hold it for a few seconds before setting it down. The men all nodded like they were watching a trick at the circus. "Can she really read?" Carlos asked. Henley pointed to a newspaper on the bar. "Read that, Mercy." Mercy picked up the paper and read the headline out loud. "New silver mine opens east of town. Brings hope for prosperity." Her voice was clear and strong, even though her hands were shaking. The silver-haired man smiled, but it wasn't a nice smile. It was the kind of smile a cat gives a mouse right before it pounces. "Very impressive. What's your price, Henley?" "Well, I owe Pete here $50 for drinks, and Carlos another $30 for that horse that went lame. Then there's my room rent, and the money I borrowed from you last month." Henley's voice got smaller with each debt he listed. "That's over $100, Henley," Pete said, shaking his head. "You ain't got nothing worth that much." "She is," the stranger said, still looking at Mercy like she was a piece of meat. "I'll take her off your hands for a barrel of my best Kentucky whiskey. That's worth $60 easy." Mercy felt the world spinning around her like she was falling down a deep, dark hole. A barrel of whiskey. That's what her life was worth to these men. Not even real money. Just enough drink to keep Henley drunk for a few more weeks. "I don't know," Henley started to say, but his voice had no strength in it. "It's a fair trade," the stranger said, pulling out a gold watch and checking the time. "Better than fair considering the legal troubles you'll have if you can't pay your debts. There are men in this town who don't like waiting for their money, if you catch my meaning." Mercy saw Henley's face go white as fresh snow. She knew about the men the stranger was talking about. They were the kind of men who broke fingers when people couldn't pay what they owed. "1 barrel of Kentucky whiskey," Henley said finally, his voice barely louder than the wind outside. "For the girl." The stranger stuck out his hand, and Henley shook it. Just like that, Mercy's life had been traded away, like she was a sack of grain or a broken-down horse. But then something happened that none of them expected. The saloon doors opened again, and Pastor Jeremiah Reynolds walked in. He was a tall, thin man with kind eyes and hands that were rough from building things. His dark skin was dusty from walking across town, and his simple black coat was patched in 3 places. The pastor looked around the smoky room, his eyes stopping on each face before finally settling on Mercy. When their eyes met, she saw something in his face that she hadn't seen in any of the other men's faces. He looked at her like she was a person, not a thing to be bought and sold. "Gentlemen," Pastor Reynolds said, his voice calm and steady, "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation from outside. Are you really planning to sell this young woman?" The saloon went quiet as a graveyard at midnight. Even the piano player in the corner stopped his tune and turned to look at the pastor standing in the doorway. Mercy held her breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The stranger with the silver hair laughed, but it sounded like rocks falling down a hill. "Well, well, look what the wind blew in. Pastor, this is business between men. No concern of yours." Pastor Reynolds stepped further into the room, his boots making soft sounds on the sticky floor. He moved slowly, like he was walking through a church instead of a dirty saloon. When a human being is being sold like cattle, it becomes everyone's concern, especially mine. "Now, hold on there, Pastor," Pete Murphy said, wiping his hands on his dirty apron. "Nobody's doing nothing wrong here. Henley's got debts to pay, and Mr. Calhoun here is helping him out." So that was the stranger's name, Calhoun. Mercy filed it away in her mind, along with the way his eyes got narrow and mean when Pastor Reynolds looked at him. "Helping him out by buying a person?" Pastor Reynolds asked. His voice stayed calm, but Mercy could hear something harder underneath it, like steel wrapped in silk. "Mr. Henley, surely you can find another way to pay your debts." Henley looked down at his boots, his face red with shame. "I ain't got nothing else, Pastor. Already sold my horse, my good clothes, everything I owned. This is the only way." "There's always another way," Pastor Reynolds said gently. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather bag. It jingled softly with the sound of coins. "How much do you owe, Mr. Henley?" $87, Henley mumbled. Pastor Reynolds opened the bag and poured the coins onto the bar. They clinked and rolled, silver and gold catching the lamplight. Mercy counted them without meaning to. It was more money than she had ever seen in one place. $63, Pastor Reynolds said. Every cent I have in the world. It's not enough to cover all your debts, but it's honest money. Real money. Not the promise of whiskey that will be gone in a week. Calhoun's face got dark as a storm cloud. Pastor, you're interfering with a legal business transaction. The girl belongs to Henley, and he has the right to sell her to whoever he chooses. Does he? Pastor Reynolds asked. He looked straight at Calhoun, and Mercy saw something pass between the two men like lightning jumping from cloud to cloud. Are you so sure about that, Mr. Calhoun? Something in the pastor's voice made Mercy's heart jump. There was a secret hidden in those words. Something important that she didn't understand yet. Calhoun's eyes got even narrower. What are you suggesting, preacher man? I'm suggesting that maybe things aren't as simple as they seem. Pastor Reynolds picked up his coins and put them back in the leather bag. Mr. Henley, I'll make you a different offer. Let Mercy come with me, and I'll give you what money I have plus my word. Then I'll work off the rest of what you owe. I'm a good carpenter, and this town needs building. I can make $20 a month easy, maybe more. Henley looked back and forth between Pastor Reynolds and Calhoun, like a dog caught between two masters. Mercy could see the war going on in his mind. The easy way out that Calhoun offered, or the harder path that the pastor was showing him. The girl comes with me, Calhoun said, his voice getting harder. We already shook hands on it. A deal's a deal. A deal made under pressure isn't a real deal, Pastor Reynolds replied. And a deal that treats a human being like property isn't a deal that God would bless. Calhoun stood up from his chair so fast it almost tipped over. He was taller than Pastor Reynolds, and probably stronger, but the pastor didn't back down even a step. You're starting to annoy me, preacher. This girl is coming with me, and that's final. No, said a voice that surprised everyone in the room, including Mercy herself. It was her own voice, speaking up for the first time since this whole nightmare started. No, I ain't going with you. Every eye in the saloon turned to look at her. Mercy felt her knees shaking, but she kept talking anyway. If somebody's gonna buy my freedom, it's gonna be somebody who sees me as more than just a thing to own. Calhoun's face twisted up like he had tasted something sour. Girl, you don't get a choice in this matter. You belong to Henley, and now you belong to me. Do I? Mercy asked. She looked at Pastor Reynolds, and he gave her a small nod that filled her with courage she didn't know she had. How do you know I belong to anybody? Because I got the papers that say so, Henley said quickly, but his voice shook when he said it. Show them to me, Pastor Reynolds said. Henley patted his pockets, then looked around the room like the papers might be hiding somewhere. They're back at my room, safe and sound. Are they? Pastor Reynolds asked. Because I've been wondering about those papers ever since Mercy started coming to my church. She's told me about her mother, about the plantation where she was born, and I've been doing some checking. Mercy's heart started beating faster. What kind of checking? What did Pastor Reynolds know that she didn't? Calhoun must have sensed danger too, because he stepped closer to Mercy and grabbed her arm. His fingers were strong and cold, and they dug into her skin like claws. Enough talking. The girl comes with me now. But before he could pull her toward the door, the saloon filled with the sound of footsteps on the porch outside. Heavy boots, more than one person, walking with the steady rhythm of men who meant business. The saloon doors swung open, and 3 men walked in. Mercy recognized them right away. Miguel Santos, the blacksmith who had arms like tree trunks from working with iron all day. Old Pete Wilson, who ran the general store and was the toughest man in town despite being nearly 70. And behind them, Emma Watson, the seamstress who made the prettiest dresses in Tombstone. Heard there was some trouble over here, Miguel said, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. His eyes found Calhoun's hand on Mercy's arm, and his face got hard as the metal he worked with every day. No trouble, Calhoun said quickly, but he didn't let go of Mercy's arm. Just concluding some business. What kind of business? Emma asked. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but her voice could cut glass when she was angry, and she looked very angry right now. The kind that's none of your concern, Calhoun replied. Old Pete Wilson stepped forward. Despite his age, he moved like a man who had seen plenty of fights and won most of them. See, that's where you're wrong, stranger. Mercy here is part of our church family. That makes her our concern." Mercy felt tears starting in her eyes. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of something she had never felt before. The feeling of belonging to people who cared about her not because they owned her, but because they chose to. "This is getting out of hand," Pete Murphy said from behind the bar. "Maybe we should all just calm down." And his words were cut off by the sound of thunder rolling across the sky outside. Through the dirty windows, Mercy could see dark clouds gathering over the desert. A storm was coming, and she could feel it in the air. The electricity that made your skin tingle and your hair stand up. Calhoun looked around the room at all the faces staring back at him. For the first time since he had walked into the saloon, he looked uncertain. "The law is on my side here. I have every right to take what I've paid for." "Do you?" Pastor Reynolds asked again. That same mysterious tone was back in his voice, the one that suggested he knew something important. "Are you absolutely certain about that, Mr. Calhoun?" The thunder rumbled again, closer this time. And in that sound, Mercy heard something that might have been hope, or might have been the promise of a storm that would wash away everything she thought she knew about her life. Lightning flashed outside the windows, and for just a moment, the whole saloon was lit up bright as day. In that flash of light, Mercy saw all the faces around her, some friendly, some hostile, some uncertain. But all of them were looking at her like she mattered, like what happened to her was important. And for the first time in her life, Mercy began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was worth more than a barrel of whiskey after all. The crack of lightning split the sky like God himself was tearing the heavens apart. In that brilliant flash, everything in Murphy's saloon froze like a picture. Calhoun's white knuckles gripping Mercy's arm, Pastor Reynolds stepping forward with fire in his gentle eyes, and the faces of the townspeople ready for a fight that could change everything. Then the thunder hit like a cannon blast, shaking the windows and rattling the bottles behind the bar. In the darkness that followed, Calhoun made his move. "We're leaving," he snarled, dragging Mercy toward the door. "And anybody who tries to stop me will answer to my men outside." But as they reached the swinging doors, Miguel Santos moved faster than a man his size should have been able to. His massive hand clamped down on Calhoun's wrist, like a bear trap snapping shut. "Let her go," Miguel said quietly. His voice was calm, but there was something dangerous underneath it, like the rumble before an earthquake. Calhoun tried to pull free, but Miguel's grip was iron. "You're making a big mistake, Blacksmith. I've got friends in this territory. Important friends." "So do we," Emma Watson said from across the room. Her small hands were busy with something in her sewing basket, and when she pulled them out, she was holding a Derringer pistol no bigger than her palm. "And right now, our friends are standing right here in this room." The saloon had turned into a powder keg with the fuse already lit. Mercy could feel the tension crackling in the air like the electricity from the storm outside. Men were reaching for weapons they might or might not have, and she knew that in another few seconds, people were going to start bleeding. That's when Pastor Reynolds did something nobody expected. He started to laugh. Not a mean laugh or a crazy laugh, but a deep, warm chuckle that seemed to fill the whole room. Everyone turned to stare at him like he had lost his mind. "You know what's funny about all this?" Pastor Reynolds said, still smiling. "We're all standing here ready to fight over something that might not even be legal in the first place." "What do you mean?" Henley asked. His face had gone pale as milk, and sweat was dripping down his forehead despite the cool air coming through the windows. Pastor Reynolds reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It looked official, with fancy writing and a red seal at the bottom. "This came in on the stage from Phoenix 3 days ago. It's a letter from the territorial government about the legal status of freed slaves." Calhoun's eyes narrowed to slits. "What kind of letter?" "The kind that says anyone born to a freed slave is automatically free themselves, regardless of any papers that claim otherwise." Pastor Reynolds unfolded the letter slowly, like he was unwrapping a Christmas present. "The kind that says selling free people into slavery is a federal crime punishable by 10 years in prison." The silence that followed was so complete that Mercy could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Even the storm outside seemed to pause, waiting to see what would happen next. "You're bluffing," Calhoun said, but his voice had lost its confident edge. "Am I?" Pastor Reynolds held up the letter. "Miguel, you can read. Would you mind taking a look at this?" Miguel released Calhoun's wrist and took the paper. His lips moved slowly as he read. his face growing more serious with each line. When he finished, he looked up at Mercy with something like wonder in his dark eyes. "It's true," he said softly. "Says here that any child born to a freed slave after 1863 is legally free, no matter what any local papers might claim." Mercy felt the world spinning around her like she was caught in a tornado. "My mama? When was my mama freed?" Pastor Reynolds smiled gently. "According to the records I found, your mother was freed in 1861 when her first master died and left instructions in his will. That was 6 years before you were born, Mercy. You've been free your whole life." The wooden bird in Mercy's pocket suddenly felt warm against her leg, like it was coming alive. Her mama's words echoed in her memory. "This bird's gonna fly free someday, just like you will, baby girl." Had her mama known? Had she always known that Mercy was born free? Calhoun's face had turned an ugly shade of red. "That paper doesn't prove anything about this specific girl. You'd need her mother's freedom papers, and I'll bet you don't have those." "Actually," said a new voice from the doorway, "we do." Everyone turned to see a small, elderly woman stepping into the saloon. She was bent with age and leaning heavily on a walking stick, but her eyes were sharp as broken glass. Mercy had never seen her before, but something about her face seemed familiar. "Who are you?" Pastor Reynolds asked gently. "My name is Ruth Johnson," the old woman said. "I was the cook on the Johnson plantation in Georgia, and I knew Mercy's mama, Grace, better than anybody in this world." Mercy's knees went weak. Grace. That had been her mama's name, though Mercy hadn't heard it spoken aloud in years. Everyone had just called her Grace's girl, or the young one. Ruth Johnson reached into a small bag she carried and pulled out a yellowed piece of paper, folded and refolded so many times it was soft as cloth. "Grace asked me to keep this safe before she died, made me promise to find her daughter someday and give it to her." With shaking hands, Mercy took the paper and unfolded it carefully. The writing was faded, but she could still make out the important words. "Certificate of Manumission. Grace Johnson, freed this day in the year of our Lord, 1861. All children born to said Grace Johnson shall be considered free persons." The paper fluttered in Mercy's hands, like the wings of a bird trying to escape a cage. She looked up at Ruth Johnson, tears streaming down her face. "You knew my mama, child? I helped deliver you into this world," Ruth said, her own eyes wet with tears. "Your mama used to sing to you every night, told you stories about birds that could fly anywhere they wanted to go. She never forgot that you were born free, even when times got hard after the war." Calhoun made a sound like a snake with its tail caught under a rock. "This is all very touching, but those papers could be fake. Anyone can write words on old paper." "True," said another voice from outside, "but territorial records don't lie." Marshal Tom Bradley stepped through the saloon doors, rainwater dripping from his hat and coat. He was a tall man with gray hair and eyes that had seen too much of both good and evil in his years keeping peace in Arizona territory. "Marshal Bradley," Pastor Reynolds said with obvious relief. "Thank you for coming so quickly. Got your message about possible slave trading." The marshal replied. "Rode hard through the storm to get here." His sharp eyes moved around the room, taking in every face and every weapon. "Now, somebody want to tell me what's going on?" Before anyone else could speak, Calhoun stepped forward. "Marshal, this is all a misunderstanding. I made a legal purchase from Mr. Henley here for his slave girl. These people are trying to interfere with a lawful business transaction." Marshal Bradley looked at the papers in Mercy's hands, then at the letter Pastor Reynolds was holding. "Mind if I take a look at those documents?" For the next few minutes, the only sounds in the saloon were the rustling of papers and the steady drumbeat of rain on the roof. The marshal read slowly and carefully, checking seals and signatures like a man who knew the difference between real and fake. Finally, he looked up. "Well, this is interesting. According to these papers, Miss Mercy here has been a free woman since the day she was born." His steely gaze fixed on Calhoun, which means any attempt to buy or sell her would be kidnapping under territorial law. Calhoun's face went through several colors before settling on a sickly green. That is, I was acting in good faith based on the information I was given." "Were you?" Marshal Bradley asked. "Because I've been hearing stories about you, Mr. Calhoun. Stories about you buying people who might not actually be slaves then selling them to mines and ranches where nobody asks too many questions. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mercy realized that she wasn't the first person Calhoun had tried to buy. There were others, maybe lots of others, who hadn't been lucky enough to have a pastor and a community willing to fight for them. "I want him arrested," Emma Watson said firmly. "If he's been kidnapping free people, he needs to face justice." "Now hold on," Pete Murphy said from behind the bar. "Let's not get carried away here. Maybe Mr. Calhoun just made an honest mistake." "An honest mistake?" Miguel's voice rumbled with anger. "He was going to drag Mercy away from her home, her church, her friends. What do you think would have happened to her?" Old Pete Wilson spat into the spittoon beside his chair. "Same thing that's been happening to others, I reckon. Work them to death in some mine or ranch where nobody knows their name." The storm outside was getting stronger, rattling the windows and sending sheets of rain across the dusty street. But inside the saloon, a different kind of storm was brewing. The storm of people who had finally had enough of seeing others treated like property. "Marshall," Pastor Reynolds said quietly, "what happens now?" Marshall Bradley folded the papers and handed them back to Mercy. "Now, Miss Mercy gets to decide what she wants to do with her life. She's a free woman, and free women make their own choices." Mercy looked around the room at all the faces watching her. Some were friendly, like Pastor Reynolds and Miguel and Emma. Some were uncertain, like Pete Murphy and Carlos Martinez. And some, like Calhoun, were filled with anger and hate. But for the first time in her life, none of that mattered. Because for the first time in her life, the choice was hers to make. "I want to go home," she said simply. "I want to go to the church with Pastor Reynolds. And I want to continue learning to read and write and be useful. But I want to do it as a free person." Thunder crashed overhead like the sky was applauding her decision. 3 months had passed since that stormy night in Murphy's saloon, and the little parsonage behind the church felt more like home than anywhere Mercy had ever lived. She swept the wooden floors each morning while humming songs her mama used to sing, tended the small garden where beans and corn grew tall and green, and spent her evenings learning to write her letters with the kind of careful beauty that made words look like art. "Your penmanship is getting mighty fine," Pastor Reynolds said, looking over her shoulder at the letter she was writing to Ruth Johnson. "Mrs. Johnson will be proud to see how much you've improved." Mercy smiled as she dipped her pen in the ink bottle again. Writing letters to Ruth had become one of her favorite things to do. The old woman had stayed in Tombstone for 2 weeks after that night in the saloon, telling Mercy stories about her mama and the plantation and the early days after the war. Then she had moved on to California to live with her sister, but she wrote to Mercy every few weeks with news and encouragement. "Pastor Reynolds," Mercy said, pausing in her writing, "do you think my mama knew? About me being born free, I mean." Pastor Reynolds settled into his chair by the window, where the afternoon light made his hair look silver at the edges. "I think your mama knew a lot of things she never got the chance to tell you, but I also think she made sure you learned the most important thing." "What's that?" "That your worth doesn't come from what other people say about you. It comes from who you choose to be." Mercy nodded, thinking about the wooden bird that now sat on the windowsill, its brass wire wing catching the sunlight. Pastor Reynolds had mended it the week after she moved in, working carefully with tiny tools to fix what had been broken. It looked different now. You could see where the repair had been made, but somehow it seemed stronger than before. Outside, she could hear the sounds of Tombstone going about its daily business. Horses clomping down the dusty street, children playing games behind the houses, Miguel's hammer ringing against iron in his blacksmith shop. It was a good sound, the sound of a community where she belonged. But that peaceful afternoon was shattered by the thunder of hoofbeats coming fast down the main street. Mercy looked up from her letter to see 3 riders pulling up in front of the church. Her blood turned cold when she recognized the man in the lead. It was Calhoun. He had left town the night Marshall Bradley confronted him, disappearing into the storm like a bad dream. But now he was back, and he wasn't alone. The 2 men with him looked like the kind of men you wouldn't want to meet in a dark alley, hard faces, cold eyes, and guns hanging from their belts like they knew how to use them. "Pastor Reynolds," Mercy whispered, her voice tight with fear. "He's back." Pastor Reynolds looked out the window, and his face went grim. "Stay inside, Mercy. Lock the door behind me." "Where you going?" "To have a conversation with our visitors." Pastor Reynolds stood up slowly, but there was nothing uncertain about the way he moved. And to remind them that they're not welcome here. Mercy watched through the window as Pastor Reynolds walked out to meet the three men. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could see the tension in their bodies. The way Calhoun pointed toward the church and made gestures with his hands. The two men with him kept looking around like they were planning something. After a few minutes, the men rode away, but not before Calhoun turned back and stared directly at the window where Mercy was watching. Even from that distance, she could feel the hate in his eyes like a cold wind. Pastor Reynolds came back inside, his face troubled. "They're not giving up," he said simply. "What did they want?" "Calhoun claims he has new papers. Says he bought them from someone who had a better legal claim to you than Henley did." Pastor Reynolds shook his head. "It's all lies, of course. But lies can be dangerous when they're backed up by men with guns." Mercy felt her stomach twist into knots. "What are we going to do?" "We're going to trust in the law and in the people who care about you," Pastor Reynolds said firmly. "And we're going to be very careful." But being careful wasn't enough to stop what happened 3 days later. Mercy was in the church that morning, sweeping the pews and arranging the hymnals for Sunday service, when she heard voices outside. At first, she thought it might be early arrivals for the women's prayer circle that met on Thursday mornings. But then she heard Emma Watson's voice, high and frightened. "You can't just take her. She's a free woman." Mercy dropped her broom and ran to the window. Outside, she saw Calhoun and his two men facing off against Emma, Miguel, and old Pete Wilson. But this time, Calhoun was holding a piece of paper that looked official, with seals and ribbons like the documents Marshal Bradley had examined. "Here's a court order from the territorial judge in Phoenix," Calhoun was saying, his voice loud enough for half the town to hear. "Says the girl belongs to the estate of one Marcus Henley, deceased, and I'm the legal representative of that estate." Mercy's heart stopped beating for a moment. Marcus Henley, that was Jacob Henley's father, who had died years before. But Jacob had never mentioned having any brothers or cousins who might inherit his property. "That's impossible," Miguel said, but his voice didn't sound as certain as usual. "Jacob Henley didn't have any family." "Shows how much you know," one of Calhoun's men said with a nasty grin. "Mr. Calhoun here is Marcus Henley's nephew, and according to the law, he inherited everything when Jacob died last month." Mercy felt the world spinning around her like she was caught in a dust devil. Jacob Henley was dead? When had that happened? And if he was dead, what did that mean for her? Emma Watson stepped forward, her small chin jutting out defiantly. "Even if that's true, it doesn't matter. Mercy was born free. We have the papers to prove it." "Papers can be forged," Calhoun said smoothly. "And even if they're real, this court order supersedes them. The girl comes with me today." "Like hell she does," said a new voice. Pastor Reynolds came around the corner of the church, walking fast but not running. His face was calm, but Mercy could see something dangerous in his eyes. The same look he'd had that night in the saloon. "Pastor," Calhoun said with a fake smile, "just the man I wanted to see. I'm sure you'll want to do the Christian thing and help me retrieve my property." "The only property I see here is that piece of paper you're waving around," Pastor Reynolds replied, "and I have serious doubts about its authenticity." Calhoun's smile got uglier. "Are you calling me a liar, preacher?" "I'm saying that convenient documents have a way of appearing when unscrupulous men want something badly enough." Pastor Reynolds stepped closer to Calhoun, and even though he was smaller and older, something about him made Calhoun take a step back. "I'm also saying that Mercy stays right where she is until Marshal Bradley can examine your so-called court order. Marshal Bradley is 3 days right away, and I'm not waiting that long," Calhoun snarled. "The girl comes with me now, or things are going to get unpleasant for everyone in this town." The two men with Calhoun moved their hands closer to their guns, and Mercy realized that this wasn't just about legal papers anymore. This was about power, and fear, and the willingness to use violence to get what you wanted. But then something amazing happened. People started coming out of the buildings around the town square. Not just a few people, but dozens of them. Mexican families from the south side of town, freed slaves who had settled in Tombstone after the war, white settlers who had gotten to know Mercy through the church. They came quietly, without weapons, but there were a lot of them. More than there were of Calhoun and his men. "Looks like you're outnumbered," old Pete Wilson observed mildly. Calhoun looked around at the growing crowd, his face getting redder by the minute. "This doesn't change anything. I have the law on my side. Do you? Asked a familiar voice. Marshal Bradley rode into the town square like an answer to prayer, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. Behind him rode 2 deputy marshals, both armed and looking serious as death. Marshal Bradley, Pastor Reynolds said with obvious relief. Mr. Calhoun here claims to have a court order giving him custody of Mercy. The marshal dismounted and walked over to examine Calhoun's papers. He read them slowly, turning them over to look at the seals and signatures. Finally, he looked up with a puzzled expression. This is interesting, he said. According to my records, Jacob Henley died 6 months ago, not last month. And according to the court in Phoenix, no such order was ever issued. He folded the papers and put them in his coat pocket. Mr. Calhoun, you're under arrest for fraud, attempted kidnapping, and conspiracy. Calhoun's face went white as flour. You can't prove anything. Actually, I can. Marshal Bradley signaled to his deputies, who moved to flank Calhoun's men. See, after our last encounter, I sent some telegrams to various law enforcement agencies. Turns out you've been pulling this same trick in 3 different territories. Always the same pattern. Find someone who might be confused about their legal status, forge some official-looking papers, and disappear before anyone can check your story. The crowd that had gathered began to murmur angrily. Some of them had heard rumors about people disappearing from other towns, families broken up, children sold to mines and ranches where they worked until they died. Calhoun's men were looking around nervously, realizing that they were surrounded by people who would be happy to see them face justice. One of them slowly raised his hands, showing that he wasn't going to reach for his gun. But Calhoun wasn't finished yet. With a snarl of rage, he lunged toward the church, heading straight for the door where Mercy was watching. If I can't have her legally, I'll take her anyway, he shouted. What happened next was so fast that later, people would argue about exactly how it unfolded. Pastor Reynolds threw himself between Calhoun and the church door. Miguel Santos came charging from the left like an angry bull. Emma Watson pulled out her derringer and pointed it at Calhoun's head. And old Pete Wilson, moving faster than a man his age had any right to move, stuck out his walking stick and sent Calhoun tumbling face first into the dust. By the time Calhoun stopped rolling, Marshal Bradley's deputies had him in iron shackles. Well, the marshal said dryly, I guess that settles that. Mercy came out of the church slowly, her legs shaking but her head held high. She looked down at Calhoun, covered in dust and rage, and felt something she had never felt before when looking at someone who had tried to hurt her. She felt sorry for him. I hope someday you learn to see people as more than things to be bought and sold, she said quietly. But until you do, I'm glad you can't hurt anyone else. As the deputies led Calhoun and his men away, the crowd began to disperse. But before they left, many of them stopped to speak to Mercy, to tell her they were glad she was safe, to let her know that she was part of their community now. Pastor Reynolds put his arm around her shoulders as they watched the last of the crowd drift away. You handled that with grace, he said. Your mama would be proud. Mercy looked up at the sky, where clouds were forming for another afternoon thunderstorm. But this time, she wasn't afraid of the thunder. This time, she knew that after every storm, the sun came out again, and she was free to enjoy it. The schoolhouse bell clanged like a fire alarm in the crisp morning air, but it wasn't calling children to their lessons. Mercy dropped the stack of reading primers she'd been carrying and ran toward the sound, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird trying to escape. 6 months had passed since Calhoun's arrest, and Mercy had thrown herself into building something beautiful from the ashes of her painful past. The one-room schoolhouse she'd convinced the town council to let her establish was her pride and joy. 12 desks arranged in neat rows, a chalkboard she'd painted herself, and windows that let in streams of golden sunlight. But now those windows showed her something that made her blood freeze. Smoke. Black, angry smoke, rising from the direction of Pastor Reynolds' church. She burst through the schoolhouse door to find chaos in the streets. People were running with buckets of water, shouting instructions to each other, and pointing at the orange flames that were already licking at the church's wooden walls. The fire was spreading fast, fed by the dry Arizona wind and the old timber that had been baking in the desert sun for years. Where's Pastor Reynolds? Mercy screamed at Miguel Santos, who was organizing a bucket brigade from the well in the town square. Inside, Miguel shouted back, sweat already pouring down his face from the heat. He went in to save the church records, but part of the roof came down and blocked the front door. Mercy felt her world tilt sideways. Pastor Reynolds was trapped inside a burning building, and she was standing here doing nothing. Without thinking, she ran toward the church, ignoring the shouts of people telling her to stop. The heat hit her like a physical blow when she got close to the building. The front door was indeed blocked by a burning beam that had fallen from the roof, but Mercy remembered something the others had forgotten. There was a small window in the back of the church, behind the altar, that opened into the tiny room where Pastor Reynolds kept his books and papers. She ran around to the back of the building, dodging falling sparks and breathing air that tasted like ash and fear. The window was high off the ground, but there was a rain barrel underneath it that she could use as a step. She climbed up and peered through the glass. Pastor Reynolds was inside, coughing and struggling to lift a heavy wooden box filled with church records. His face was blackened with soot, and she could see that his left arm was hanging at a strange angle, probably broken when the roof beam fell. "Pastor Reynolds!" she yelled, pounding on the window. He looked up, and his eyes went wide with fear when he saw her. "Mercy, get away from here. The whole building's going to come down." "Not without you." She grabbed a rock and smashed the window, ignoring the glass that cut her hands. "Come on, I'll help you out." For a moment, Pastor Reynolds looked like he was going to argue. But then another section of the roof groaned ominously, and he nodded. "The records," he said, lifting the heavy box toward the window. "Save the records first. They've got everyone's marriages, baptisms, everything that proves who we are." Mercy understood. In a place like Tombstone, where people came and went like tumbleweeds, those records were more than just papers. They were proof that lives mattered, that families existed, that people belonged somewhere. She took the box, grunting under its weight, and lowered it carefully to the ground. Then she reached back through the window to help Pastor Reynolds climb out. It was harder than she had expected. He was taller and heavier than she was, and his broken arm made it difficult for him to pull himself up. But fear gave her strength she didn't know she had, and together they managed to get him through the window just as another section of roof crashed down where he'd been standing. They collapsed on the ground behind the church, both of them coughing and gasping for air that didn't taste like smoke. Pastor Reynolds' arm was definitely broken, and Mercy's hands were bleeding from the broken glass. But they were alive. "The church," Pastor Reynolds said weakly, looking at the flames that were now consuming his life's work. "Everything's gone." "No," Mercy said firmly, helping him to his feet. "The building's gone. But the church isn't a building, it's the people. And we're still here." As if to prove her point, Miguel Santos and Emma Watson came running around the corner, followed by half the town. They had given up on saving the building and were now focused on making sure everyone was safe. "Thank God you're both all right," Emma said, tears streaming down her face. "When we saw you run toward the fire, we thought—" "I couldn't let him die," Mercy said simply. "He saved me. Now I saved him. That's what family does." Pastor Reynolds looked at her with something like wonder in his smoke-reddened eyes. "Family," he repeated softly. But their moment of relief was shattered by a new sound. The thunder of horses approaching at a gallop. A group of riders was coming down the main street, and even through the smoke and chaos, Mercy could see that they weren't coming to help fight the fire. They were coming to cause more trouble. The lead rider was a man Mercy had never seen before, tall and lean, with a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. He wore a black suit despite the heat, and his horse was the finest animal anyone in Tombstone had ever seen. Behind him rode 6 other men, all armed, all looking like they meant business. "Who's in charge here?" the man in black called out, his voice cutting through the noise of the crackling fire. Marshal Bradley stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his gun. "I am Tom Bradley, Territorial Marshal. And you are?" "Judge Marcus Stone, Circuit Judge for this territory." The man dismounted and pulled out an official-looking document. "I'm here on urgent business regarding the illegal harboring of stolen property." Mercy felt her stomach drop like a stone down a well. Even though Calhoun was in jail, somehow the nightmare was starting all over again. "What stolen property?" Pastor Reynolds asked, stepping protectively in front of Mercy, despite his broken arm. Judge Stone's cold eyes fixed on Mercy, like a hawk spotting a mouse. "That girl there. According to the complaint filed with my court, She's been illegally detained by this community in violation of federal law. That's impossible, Marshal Bradley said firmly. I've seen her papers. She was born free. Papers can be forged, Judge Stone replied smoothly. And I have testimony from reliable witnesses that this girl was legally purchased and then stolen by a group of abolitionists operating in defiance of territorial law. Emma Watson stepped forward, her small hands clenched into fists. What witnesses? Calhoun's in jail, and his men are with him. There are others, Judge Stone said. People who saw what happened that night in the saloon. People who are willing to testify that this community conspired to steal valuable property from its rightful owner. Old Pete Wilson spat into the dust at his feet. That's the biggest load of bull I ever heard. Mercy was never anybody's property. That's for a court to decide, Judge Stone said. And until it does, the girl comes with me. I'm placing her in protective custody pending a proper legal hearing. Over my dead body, Miguel Santos growled, moving to stand beside Pastor Reynolds. Judge Stone's hand moved to his gun. That can be arranged if necessary, but I'd prefer to handle this peacefully. I have a federal warrant for the girl's detention, and I intend to execute it. The tension in the air was thicker than the smoke from the burning church. Mercy could see that the people who had protected her before were ready to do it again, even though it might mean bloodshed this time. But she also saw something else. Judge Stone wasn't alone, and his men weren't just hired guns. They had the look of federal marshals, men who represented the power of the United States government. Fighting them wouldn't just mean a local conflict, it would mean war with federal authorities. Wait, Mercy said, stepping out from behind Pastor Reynolds. Before anybody starts shooting, I want to see this warrant. Judge Stone smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. A smart girl. Yes, you should know your legal situation. He unfolded the document and held it out for her to read. Mercy took the paper, her hand still bleeding from the broken glass but steady as she read. The legal language was complicated, but the meaning was clear enough. Someone had filed a complaint claiming that she was stolen property, and Judge Stone had the authority to take her into custody until the matter could be resolved in court. But as she read more carefully, something didn't seem right. The dates were wrong, the names were inconsistent, and some of the legal references didn't make sense. It looked official, but Mercy had been learning to read carefully, and this document had problems. This warrant was issued 3 days ago, she said slowly, but it references events that supposedly happened last week. How could you investigate and issue a warrant for something that hadn't happened yet when you wrote it? Judge Stone's expression flickered for just a moment. Clerical error. The dates will be corrected in the official record. And this signature? Mercy continued, pointing to the bottom of the page. It says it's signed by Judge Harrison in Phoenix, but I know Judge Harrison's signature because Pastor Reynolds showed me some court documents last month. This doesn't look the same. Now Judge Stone's face was definitely showing cracks in his calm facade. Young lady, you're hardly qualified to judge the authenticity of legal documents. Maybe not, Mercy said, but Marshal Bradley is, and he knows Judge Harrison personally. She looked at the marshal, who was studying the warrant with increasing suspicion. She's right, Marshal Bradley said after a long moment. This isn't Judge Harrison's signature. And the seal is wrong too. Judge Harrison uses a different seal than this one. The mood in the crowd began to shift. What had started as fear was turning into anger, as people realized they were being deceived again. You're a fraud, Emma Watson said, her voice shaking with rage. Just like Calhoun. Worse than Calhoun, Miguel added. At least he didn't pretend to be a judge. Judge Stone's hand moved closer to his gun, and his men tensed behind him. I don't have to listen to accusations from a bunch of ignorant frontier trash. The girl comes with me, and anyone who interferes will be arrested for obstructing federal justice. What federal justice? Called a new voice. Everyone turned to see a real federal marshal riding into town, flanked by 4 genuine deputies. Mercy recognized him immediately. Marshal William Hayes, who had visited Tombstone several times over the past few months to check on federal cases in the territory. Marshal Hayes, Marshal Bradley said with obvious relief. Perfect timing. Marshal Hayes dismounted and walked over to examine the crowd, his experienced eyes taking in the burning church, the assembled townspeople, and the group of armed men claiming to be federal agents. What's going on here? He asked. "This man claims to be Judge Marcus Stone," Marshal Bradley said, pointing to the man in black. "Says he has a federal warrant to take Mercy into custody." Marshal Hayes looked at the man claiming to be Judge Stone, and his face went hard as granite. "Really? That's interesting. Because I know Judge Marcus Stone personally. We served together in the war. And you, sir, are definitely not him." The fake judge's face went white as bleached bone. There must be some mistake." "Oh, there's a mistake, all right," Marshal Hayes said grimly. "The mistake is thinking you could impersonate a federal judge in my territory and get away with it." He signaled to his deputies. "Arrest him and his men. Charges include impersonating a federal officer, fraud, conspiracy, and attempted kidnapping." What happened next was chaos. The fake judge's men realized their game was up and went for their guns. The townspeople scattered for cover behind buildings and water troughs, and Mercy found herself once again in the middle of a gunfight that was all about her. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't just a helpless victim waiting to see what men with guns would decide about her life. This time, she was part of a community that would fight for her, and she was ready to fight for them too. The gunfight lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt like hours. When the smoke cleared, 3 of the fake judge's men were wounded, 2 were dead, and the rest were in custody. The man who had claimed to be Judge Stone was sitting in the dust, with blood running down his face from where Marshal Hayes had pistol-whipped him. "Who sent you?" Marshal Hayes demanded, standing over the wounded fraud. The man looked up with hate in his eyes but said nothing. "It was Calhoun," Mercy said suddenly. "Even from jail, he's still trying to get me. He must have friends who are willing to help him." Marshal Hayes nodded grimly. "That makes sense. We've been tracking a network of slave traders who've been operating across several territories. Looks like we just found another piece of their operation." As the wounded men were loaded into a wagon to be taken to the territorial prison, Mercy looked around at the scene of destruction. The church was still burning, though the fire was finally starting to die down. The street was torn up from the gunfight, and there were bloodstains in the dust where people had fought for her freedom. "I'm sorry," she said to Pastor Reynolds, who was cradling his broken arm. "This is all my fault. If I hadn't come here, none of this would have happened." Pastor Reynolds looked at her with surprise. "Mercy, child, this isn't your fault. Evil men make evil choices. All you did was try to live a free life. But your church is gone, and people got hurt." "Churches can be rebuilt," Pastor Reynolds said gently. "And the people who got hurt did it by choice, because they believe freedom is worth fighting for. Don't you dare blame yourself for other people's goodness." Mercy looked around at the faces of the people who had risked everything for her. Miguel with his burned hands from fighting the fire, Emma with tears in her eyes as she watched the church burn, old Pete leaning heavily on his walking stick but still ready to fight. These people had become her family, and family protected each other. "We'll rebuild," she said firmly. "The church, the community, everything. And we'll make it stronger than before." Marshal Hayes overheard her and nodded approvingly. "That's the spirit. And you'll have federal protection while you do it. I'm assigning 2 deputies to stay in Tombstone until we're sure this network is completely broken up." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of orange and red, Mercy stood in the ruins of the church and made herself a promise. She would never again be the cause of violence and destruction. From now on, she would use her freedom to build things, not just survive the people who wanted to tear them down. The wooden bird in her pocket seemed to grow warm against her leg, reminding her of her mama's words. "This bird's gonna fly free someday, just like you will, baby girl." She was free now. The question was what she would do with that freedom. The territorial courthouse in Phoenix looked like a castle made of red stone, with windows that caught the morning sun like jewels. Mercy had never seen a building so grand, and under other circumstances, she might have marveled at its beauty. But today, as she climbed the steps between Pastor Reynolds and Marshal Hayes, all she could think about was the trial that would finally determine her fate once and for all. It had been 2 months since the fake judge's attack on Tombstone, and the legal wheels had been turning slowly but steadily. The territorial government had decided that Mercy's case needed to be settled by the highest court in Arizona Territory, with all the evidence presented properly and all the claims examined by experts. "Remember," Marshal Hayes said quietly as they approached the courthouse doors, Tell the truth simply and clearly. Don't let the lawyers confuse you with fancy words. Your story is powerful enough on its own. Mercy nodded, clutching the folder that contained all her documents, her mother's freedom papers, Ruth Johnson's testimony, the forged bills of sale that Calhoun and his associates had used, and letters from dozens of people in Tombstone who were willing to testify about her character and her status in the community. But she was nervous. The man prosecuting the case against her was Jeremiah Whitlock, the most famous lawyer in the territory. He was known for winning cases that seemed impossible, and he had a reputation for being as smooth as silk and as deadly as a rattlesnake. The word around Phoenix was that someone was paying him a lot of money to prove that Mercy was still legally a slave. "Miss Mercy," said a gentle voice behind her. She turned to see a small, elderly man with kind eyes and a worn leather briefcase. This was Samuel Morrison, the lawyer who had volunteered to represent her. Unlike Whitlock, Morrison didn't have a fancy reputation or expensive clothes. He was known for taking cases that nobody else wanted, usually for people who couldn't afford to pay him. "Mr. Morrison," Pastor Reynolds said, shaking the lawyer's hand, "thank you again for taking this case." "It's my honor," Morrison replied. "No person should have their freedom decided by fraudulent documents and corrupt officials. We're going to set the record straight today." They entered the courthouse together, their footsteps echoing in the marble hallway. The courtroom was already packed with people, reporters from newspapers across the territory, lawyers curious about the case, and citizens who had traveled from as far away as Tucson to witness what everyone was calling the most important freedom trial in Arizona Territory history. Mercy felt her stomach flutter like it was full of butterflies when she saw who was sitting at the prosecutor's table. Jeremiah Whitlock was even more intimidating in person than she had imagined. Tall and distinguished, with silver hair and clothes that probably cost more than most people in Tombstone made in a year. Next to him sat several assistants with stacks of legal books and papers. But what made her blood run cold was the man sitting in the front row of the gallery, smiling at her with pure hatred. It was Calhoun. Somehow, he had been released from jail and was here to watch her trial. "How is he here?" she whispered to Marshal Hayes. The marshal's face was grim. His lawyer got him out on bail pending his own trial. Technically, he hasn't been convicted of anything yet, so the judge had to let him go. "Don't let him intimidate you," Pastor Reynolds said softly. "He has no power over you anymore." But Mercy wasn't so sure about that. Calhoun's presence in the courtroom felt like a dark cloud hanging over everything, a reminder that there were still people who saw her as property to be bought and sold. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Thornton," called the bailiff. Everyone in the courtroom stood as Judge Thornton entered. She was a stern-looking woman with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. Mercy had heard that Judge Thornton was fair but tough, and that she didn't tolerate nonsense from either side. "Be seated," Judge Thornton said, settling into her chair behind the large wooden desk at the front of the room. "We are here today to determine the legal status of one Mercy Johnson, specifically, whether she is a free person or property subject to ownership under territorial law. Mr. Whitlock, you may present your opening statement." Jeremiah Whitlock stood up slowly, like a snake uncoiling, and walked to the center of the courtroom. When he spoke, his voice was smooth as honey and twice as sweet. "Your Honor, this case is about more than just one girl. It's about the fundamental principle of property rights that form the foundation of our legal system. The plaintiff in this case, Mr. Calhoun, legally purchased the defendant from her previous owner. He has bills of sale, witness testimony, and documentation proving his ownership. The defendant and her supporters have attempted to circumvent the law with forged documents and false testimony. But the facts are clear. Property is property, and theft is theft, regardless of the sympathetic circumstances surrounding it. Mercy felt sick to her stomach. Whitlock was talking about her like she was a horse or a piece of furniture, something that could be owned and traded and stolen. But worse than that, he was making it sound like the people who had protected her were criminals. When Whitlock finished, Samuel Morrison stood up. He was much smaller than his opponent and not nearly as polished. But when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Your Honor, this case is indeed about fundamental principles, but not property rights, human rights. The young woman sitting at this table was born free to a mother who had been legally freed years before her birth. She has never been anyone's property. And she never can be, because human beings are not property under the laws of the United States of America. What we have here is not a case of theft, but a case of attempted kidnapping carried out by criminals who prey on confusion and fear to steal people's freedom. The contrast between the two opening statements was stark. Whitlock had painted Mercy as stolen property, while Morrison had painted her as a victim of criminals. Now it would be up to Judge Thornton to decide which version of the truth was correct. "Mr. Whitlock, call your first witness," Judge Thornton said. "I called Jacob Henley to the stand." Mercy gasped. Jacob Henley was dead. She had been told so months ago. But now a man who looked exactly like him was walking to the witness chair. He was thinner than she remembered, and his hair was grayer. But it was definitely him. "Mr. Henley," Whitlock said smoothly, "please tell the court about your relationship to the defendant." "I owned her for 3 years," Henley said, not looking at Mercy. "Bought her legal and proper from the Johnson plantation in Georgia after the war. Had all the papers to prove it." "And did you subsequently sell her to Mr. Calhoun?" "I did. Sold her for a barrel of whiskey to settle my gambling debts. It was a legal transaction between two free men." Morrison stood up quickly. "Objection, Your Honor. This witness was reported dead months ago. How can a dead man testify?" Whitlock smiled. "The reports of Mr. Henley's death were greatly exaggerated, Your Honor. He was injured in a mining accident and assumed dead, but he recovered and has been convalescing in Mexico. He only recently returned to Arizona territory." Judge Thornton looked skeptical. "Mr. Henley, where exactly have you been for the past several months?" Henley shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Like the lawyer said, I was hurt bad in a mine cave, down in Sonora. Mexican family took care of me till I got better. Didn't know folks thought I was dead till I got back to Arizona." It was a plausible story, but something about it didn't feel right to Mercy. The Jacob Henley she remembered had been weak and broken by alcohol and gambling. This man seemed different, harder, more focused, like someone had been coaching him on what to say. "Mr. Henley," Morrison said when it was his turn to question the witness, "you say you bought Miss Mercy from the Johnson plantation. Do you have the bill of sale?" "Lost it in the mine accident," Henley replied quickly. "Everything I was carrying got buried when the roof came down." "How convenient. And you say you sold her to Mr. Calhoun for a barrel of whiskey. Where did this transaction take place?" "Murphy's Saloon in Tombstone." "Were there witnesses?" "Course there were. Pete Murphy saw the whole thing. So did Carlos Martinez." Morrison nodded. "And where are these witnesses today?" Henley's face flushed red. "Pete died of fever last month. Carlos moved to California." "How convenient again?" Morrison said dryly. "So, the only people who can verify your story are either dead or gone." "Objection," Whitlock called out. "Counsel is badgering the witness." "Sustained," Judge Thornton said. "Mr. Morrison, please stick to questions of fact." Morrison continued his questioning for another hour, poking holes in Henley's story and exposing inconsistencies in his testimony. But Henley stuck to his basic claim, that he had owned Mercy legally and sold her legally to Calhoun. When Henley finally left the witness stand, Mercy felt like the walls of the courtroom were closing in around her. His testimony had been full of holes, but it was still testimony from someone claiming to be her former owner. "I call Mercy Johnson to the stand," Whitlock announced. Mercy's legs felt like water as she walked to the witness chair. The courtroom was completely silent except for the sound of her footsteps on the wooden floor. She could feel dozens of eyes watching her, judging her, deciding whether she was a person or a piece of property. "Miss Johnson," Whitlock began, his voice as smooth as ever, "or do you prefer to be called by your slave name?" "Objection," Morrison called out angrily. "There is no evidence that my client ever had a slave name." "Sustained," Judge Thornton said sharply. "Mr. Whitlock, you will address the witness respectfully or face sanctions." Whitlock smiled apologetically, but Mercy could see the calculation in his eyes. He was trying to rattle her, to make her seem like less than a person in front of the judge and the crowd. "Miss Johnson," he continued, "you lived with Mr. Henley for 3 years, correct?" "Yes." "And during that time, you cooked for him, cleaned his house, and obeyed his orders?" "I did what I had to do to survive." "You never tried to leave?" Mercy thought about the question carefully. Where would I have gone? I was told I belonged to him. I was told I had no choice. But you never questioned whether you were truly his property. I was 16 years old and alone in the world, Mercy said, her voice getting stronger. When everyone around you tells you that you're a slave, it's hard to believe otherwise. But deep down, I always knew something was wrong. I always felt like I was meant to be free. Whitlock pressed her for another hour, trying to get her to admit that she had accepted her status as Henley's slave, that she had never questioned the legitimacy of his ownership. But Mercy held firm, answering each question with quiet dignity and refusing to let him make her feel ashamed of her past. When Morrison had his turn to question her, the tone changed completely. Instead of trying to tear her down, he asked her to tell her story, about her mother, about the plantation, about the years with Henley, and about finding her freedom in Tombstone. Miss Johnson, Morrison said gently, what does freedom mean to you? Mercy thought for a moment, looking out at the faces in the courtroom. She saw Pastor Reynolds, who had given her a home and a family. She saw Marshall Hayes, who had protected her from those who would steal her freedom. She saw reporters and strangers who had come to witness her fight for human dignity. Freedom means being able to choose, she said finally. It means being able to decide who you want to be, not having that decided for you by other people. It means being seen as a person, not as property. And it means having the chance to build something good with your life, instead of just surviving. When she finished testifying, Mercy felt exhausted but hopeful. She had told her truth clearly and honestly, and she believed that anyone who really listened would see that she was a free human being, not a piece of property. But the trial was far from over. Over the next 2 days, both sides called expert witnesses, document examiners, and character witnesses. Ruth Johnson testified about Mercy's mother in her freedom papers. Miguel Santos and Emma Watson traveled from Tombstone to testify about Mercy's role in their community. Marshall Bradley explained the investigation that had exposed Calhoun's criminal network. On the other side, Whitlock called witnesses who claimed to have known Mercy's mother as a slave, experts who questioned the authenticity of her freedom papers, and officials who testified about the legal complexity of determining slave status after the Civil War. Throughout it all, Calhoun sat in the front row, watching every moment with cold hatred in his eyes. And every time Mercy looked at him, she was reminded that even if she won this trial, there would always be people who saw her as less than human. Finally, on the third day, both lawyers gave their closing arguments. Whitlock spoke first, weaving a complex legal argument about property rights, the validity of documents, and the dangerous precedent that would be set if people could simply claim to be free without proper legal proof. Morrison followed with a passionate speech about human dignity, the fundamental principle that people could not be property, and the courage it took for a young woman to stand up against powerful forces that wanted to steal her freedom. When the arguments were finished, Judge Thornton announced that she would recess to consider her verdict. This is a complex case with significant implications, she said. I will not rush to judgment. Court will reconvene tomorrow morning for my decision. That night, Mercy sat in her hotel room with Pastor Reynolds and Samuel Morrison, trying not to think about what would happen if she lost. If Judge Thornton ruled against her, she would be handed over to Calhoun, and this time there might be no one able to save her. Whatever happens tomorrow, Pastor Reynolds said gently, remember that your worth doesn't come from what a judge says. It comes from who you are inside. Mercy nodded, but she couldn't shake the fear that was growing in her chest like a cold, dark flower. Tomorrow, she would learn whether the law saw her as a person or as property, and her entire future hung in the balance. The gavel came down like thunder in the hushed courtroom, and Judge Thornton's voice rang out clear as a church bell. I hereby declare that Mercy Johnson is and has always been a free woman under the laws of the United States and Arizona Territory. The explosion of noise that followed nearly lifted the roof off the courthouse. People cheered, reporters scribbled frantically in their notebooks, and Mercy felt her knees buckle as 3 years of fear and uncertainty finally melted away like ice in the desert sun. Pastor Reynolds caught her arm to steady her, tears streaming down his weathered face, while Samuel Morrison pumped his fist in the air like he'd just struck gold. But the celebration was cut short by another sound, the scraping of chairs as Calhoun and his lawyers stood up. Whitlock's face was red as a tomato, and Calhoun looked like a man who had just watched his house burn down with all his money inside. "Your Honor," Whitlock called out over the noise, "I request an immediate appeal to the Territorial Supreme Court. This verdict is based on questionable evidence and—" "Mr. Whitlock," Judge Thornton interrupted, her voice sharp as a knife. "You may certainly file an appeal if you choose, but let me be crystal clear about something. After reviewing all the evidence, I have determined that not only is Miss Johnson free, but that there is substantial evidence of a criminal conspiracy to defraud her of her liberty. I am referring this matter to the territorial prosecutor for investigation." Calhoun's face went white as fresh snow. He leaned over to whisper something urgent to Whitlock, but the lawyer was already gathering his papers with the look of a man who wanted to be anywhere else in the world. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Mercy found herself surrounded by well-wishers and reporters. Everyone wanted to shake her hand, ask her questions, or simply be part of the moment when justice had finally been served. But through the crowd, she caught sight of something that made her heart skip a beat. Calhoun was pushing through the people toward the back door, moving fast like a man who had somewhere urgent to be. And he wasn't alone. 3 men in dark coats were following him, men who looked like they might be carrying guns under their jackets. "Pastor Reynolds," Mercy whispered urgently. "Look." Pastor Reynolds followed her gaze, and his face went grim. "Marshal Hayes," he called out to the federal marshal who was talking to reporters near the front of the courtroom. But Marshal Hayes was too far away, and the crowd was too noisy. By the time they could get his attention, Calhoun and his men had disappeared through the back door. "Maybe they're just leaving," Morrison said hopefully. "After all, they lost the case. What else can they do?" Mercy shook her head. She had seen the look in Calhoun's eyes, and it wasn't the look of a man who was giving up. It was the look of a man who was planning something desperate. "We need to get back to Tombstone," she said. "Right away." "Why?" Pastor Reynolds asked. "The trial's over. You're free. What could Calhoun possibly do now?" "I don't know," Mercy replied, "but I have a bad feeling that this isn't over yet." They left Phoenix that afternoon, traveling in a wagon with Marshal Hayes and 2 of his deputies. The journey back to Tombstone usually took 2 days, but they pushed hard and made it in a day and a half, stopping only to rest the horses and grab a few hours of sleep. As they crested the hill overlooking Tombstone, Mercy felt her heart lift at the sight of her home. The town looked peaceful in the afternoon sunlight, with smoke rising from chimneys and people going about their daily business. The church had been rebuilt, bigger and prettier than before, and she could see children playing in the schoolyard. But as they got closer, she noticed something wrong. The streets were too quiet, and there were too many horses tied up in front of Murphy's saloon. Not the usual mix of ranch horses and mules that belonged to the townspeople, but fine horses that looked like they belonged to men with money. "Something's not right," Marshal Hayes said, his hand moving instinctively to his gun. "That's too many strangers for a normal day." They rode into town cautiously, and Mercy's worst fears were confirmed when she saw Miguel Santos standing in front of his blacksmith shop with his arms crossed and a worried look on his face. When he saw their wagon, he hurried over. "Thank God you're back," he said urgently. "We got trouble. Big trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Pastor Reynolds asked. "That man Calhoun showed up yesterday with about 15 men. Says he's got new legal papers that overturn the judge's decision. Claims he's here to collect his property and arrest anyone who interferes." Mercy felt her stomach drop like a stone. "Where is he now?" "Holed up in the saloon with his men. He's got the whole town scared. Says anyone who helps you or hides you will be arrested as accomplices to theft." Marshal Hayes stepped down from the wagon, his face hard as granite. "Does he have any real legal authority? Any badges or warrants?" Miguel shook his head. "Nothing that looks official to me, but he's got a lot of guns, and people are scared." "Where are Emma and old Pete and the others?" "Emma's locked herself in her shop. Old Pete's at the church with some of the families. Everyone's just trying to stay out of the way until this gets settled." Mercy looked around at her town, the place that had become her home, where she had learned what it meant to be free, where she had built something beautiful out of the ashes of her painful past. Now it was caught in the middle of a conflict that was all about her. "I won't let him hurt these people because of me," she said firmly. There has to be a way to end this without violence. The only way to end it is to arrest Calhoun and his men, Marshal Hayes said. But 15 against 3 isn't good odds, even with federal authority on our side. Maybe there's another way, Pastor Reynolds said thoughtfully. Mercy, you said Calhoun claims to have new legal papers? That's what Miguel said. Then let's see them. If they're fake, which they almost certainly are, we can prove it right here in front of the whole town. Sometimes the best way to defeat a lie is with the truth. Marshal Hayes looked skeptical. That's assuming Calhoun is willing to show his papers to anyone. Men like him don't usually submit to public scrutiny. Then we make him an offer he can't refuse, Mercy said, an idea forming in her mind. We challenge him to a public hearing right here in Tombstone. If his papers are real and legal, he gets what he wants. If they're fake, he leaves town and never comes back. That's risky, Morrison warned. What if he doesn't agree to the terms? What if he just tries to take you by force? Then at least everyone in town will see him for what he really is, Mercy replied. Sometimes you have to stand up to a bully, even if you're not sure you can win. They made their way to the church, where they found old Pete Wilson and about 20 other townspeople gathered in the sanctuary. The mood was tense, like the air before a thunderstorm, and everyone looked relieved when they saw Marshal Hayes and his deputies. What's the plan? Emma Watson asked. She had slipped over from her shop when she saw them arrive. Are we going to arrest Calhoun? We're going to give him a chance to prove his case publicly, Mercy said. If he really has legal authority, he should be willing to show it to everyone. And if he doesn't, then we'll know he's a fraud. And the whole town will know it too. Old Pete Wilson spat into the spittoon beside his chair. I like it. Nothing a liar hates more than being called out in front of everyone. Pastor Reynolds stood up and walked to the front of the church. If we're going to do this, we need to do it right. Miguel, can you spread the word? Tell everyone in town to meet here in 1 hour. Tell them we're going to settle this matter once and for all. As Miguel hurried off to gather the townspeople, Mercy sat in the front pew and tried to calm her racing heart. In 1 hour, she would face Calhoun again, and this time there would be no hiding behind lawyers or judges. It would just be her word against his, her truth against his lies, in front of everyone she cared about. You don't have to do this, Pastor Reynolds said gently, sitting beside her. We could just wait for reinforcements from the territorial capital. No, Mercy said firmly. I'm tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of letting other people fight my battles for me. If I'm really free, then I need to act like it. An hour later, the church was packed tighter than a can of sardines. Every pew was full, and people were standing along the walls and crowding into the aisles. Word had spread quickly through Tombstone, and it seemed like the entire population had come to witness what everyone knew would be the final confrontation. Marshal Hayes stood at the front of the church, his badge glinting in the lamplight. We're here tonight to settle a dispute about the legal status of Miss Mercy Johnson. Mr. Blank, Calhoun claims to have new evidence that overturns the territorial court's decision. We're giving him the opportunity to present that evidence publicly. The church door opened, and Calhoun walked in followed by 6 of his men. The rest, presumably, were still at the saloon keeping watch. He looked confident as he strode down the aisle, but Mercy noticed that his eyes kept darting around the room like he was looking for threats. Marshal Hayes, Calhoun said smoothly, I appreciate the opportunity to clear up this misunderstanding. I have here a writ from the Territorial Supreme Court overturning Judge Thornton's decision and ordering the immediate return of my property. He pulled out a document that looked official at first glance. Fancy paper, red seals, impressive signatures. But when Marshal Hayes examined it closely, his expression grew skeptical. This is dated yesterday, the marshal said. But the Territorial Supreme Court isn't even in session this week. The justices are all in Denver for a federal conference. Calhoun's confident smile flickered for just a moment. Administrative emergency session. Very rare, but not unheard of. And this signature, Marshal Hayes continued, says it's from Chief Justice Morrison. But Chief Justice Morrison is Samuel Morrison's brother, and I happen to know he's been in Washington, D.C. for the past month. The murmur that went through the church was like the sound of angry bees. People were beginning to realize that they were witnessing another fraud, another attempt to steal Mercy's freedom with fake papers and false authority. You're mistaken, Calhoun said. but his voice had lost its smooth confidence. "That document is perfectly legal." "No," said a voice from the back of the church. "It's not." Everyone turned to see a man in a judge's robes walking down the aisle. Mercy's heart nearly stopped when she recognized him. It was Judge Thornton herself, still wearing the robes from her court in Phoenix. "Your Honor," Marshal Hayes said with surprise, "what brings you to Tombstone?" "I received a telegram this morning about fake court documents being circulated in my name," Judge Thornton replied. "I rode hard to get here before any more damage could be done." She looked directly at Calhoun. "Mr. Calhoun, that document you're holding is a forgery. The Territorial Supreme Court has issued no such writ, and even if they had, it would require my signature as the trial judge. This signature is not mine." The church erupted in angry voices. People were shouting about liars and frauds and criminals who thought they could fool honest folks. Calhoun's men looked around nervously, realizing that they were vastly outnumbered by people who were very, very angry. "Furthermore," Judge Thornton continued, raising her voice over the noise, "I have signed a warrant for Mr. Calhoun's arrest on charges of contempt of court, fraud, and conspiracy. Marshal Hayes, please take him into custody." What happened next was chaos. Calhoun's men went for their guns, the townspeople dove for cover, and Marshal Hayes and his deputies found themselves in the middle of a gunfight inside a church full of innocent people. But the fight didn't last long. Calhoun's men were outnumbered 20-1, and when the townspeople realized what was happening, they didn't just hide, they fought back. Miguel Santos grabbed a candlestick and used it like a club. Emma Watson had her derringer out again. Even old Pete Wilson swung his walking stick like a weapon. When the smoke cleared, 3 of Calhoun's men were wounded, 2 had surrendered, and Calhoun himself was on his knees with Marshal Hayes' gun pointed at his head. "It's over," Marshal Hayes said firmly. "You're under arrest, and this time you're going to stay in jail until you stand trial for all your crimes." As the deputies led Calhoun away in shackles, he turned back to look at Mercy one last time. But instead of the hatred she expected to see, there was something else in his eyes. Defeat. The look of a man who had finally realized that some fights couldn't be won through force and fraud. "Miss Johnson," Judge Thornton said, walking over to where Mercy stood among her friends and family, "I want you to know that this court order makes your freedom final and absolute. No one can ever question your status again. You are free, legally and completely, and anyone who tries to change that will answer to the full power of the territorial government." Mercy felt tears streaming down her face as she looked around at all the people who had risked everything to protect her freedom. These people had become more than just neighbors or fellow church members. They had become her family, chosen not by blood but by love and shared commitment to justice. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "All of you, thank you for showing me what it means to be truly free." Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, Mercy felt like she could breathe freely, like the weight that had been pressing down on her chest for so long had finally been lifted. She was free, not just legally, but truly free. And now she could begin to build the life she had always dreamed of. 10 years later, 1,877. The applause thundered through the packed town hall like summer rain on a tin roof, but Mercy barely heard it as she stood at the podium looking out at the sea of faces that had gathered for the dedication of the Mercy Johnson School for All Children. Where once there had been a single room with 12 desks, now there was a beautiful 2-story building with 6 classrooms, a library, and enough space for every child in Tombstone and the surrounding area. "When I was 26 years old," Mercy began, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the hall, "I thought my worth was measured by what others were willing to pay for me. I believed the lies that told me I was property, that my value came from how useful I could be to someone else." In the front row, Pastor Reynolds sat with tears of pride shining in his eyes. His hair was completely gray now, and he walked with a cane, but his smile was as warm as ever. Beside him sat Marshal Hayes, who had become not just a protector but a dear friend over the years. Emma Watson was there too, now married to Miguel Santos and the mother of 3 children who were among Mercy's first students. "But I learned something that changed everything," Mercy continued. "I learned that worth isn't something others give you. It's something you discover within yourself. And once you know your own worth, no one can ever take it away from you. The crowd included faces both familiar and new. Ruth Johnson had traveled all the way from California to be there, though she was nearly 80 now and needed help walking. Dr. Sarah Chen, the Chinese doctor who had moved to Tombstone 3 years ago and become Mercy's closest friend, sat with her medical bag at her feet, ready to help anyone who might need it during the celebration. But perhaps the most surprising guest was Jacob Henley, sober for 5 years now and working as the school's groundskeeper. The man who had once tried to sell her for a barrel of whiskey now tended the gardens where children played, finding his own redemption through service to the community he had once helped tear apart. This school represents more than just education, Mercy said, holding up the wooden bird that had become her symbol. Its brass wire wing caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. It represents the truth that every child, regardless of their background or the circumstances of their birth, has infinite value and unlimited potential. The wooden bird had traveled a long journey since that night in Murphy's saloon. It had been broken and mended, like Mercy herself. And now it sat on her desk every day as a reminder that broken things could be made beautiful again. We have children here whose parents were slaves, children whose families came from Mexico and China and Ireland, children whose ancestors lived on this land for thousands of years before any of us arrived. They all learn together, play together, and discover together that the differences between us are far less important than the things that unite us. Through the window, Mercy could see the new church that the community had built together, bigger and more beautiful than the one that had burned, with a bell tower that could be heard for miles around. Next to it was the expanded clinic, where Dr. Chen treated patients regardless of their ability to pay. And beyond that was the thriving Main Street, where businesses owned by people of every background worked side by side. Tombstone had grown in the 10 years since Mercy's trial, but it had grown in the right direction. Instead of becoming another rough frontier town where might made right, it had become a place where people of different backgrounds could build lives together based on mutual respect and shared values. I want to tell you about some of our students, Mercy continued, gesturing toward a group of children sitting in the front rows. Maria Santos learned to read in Spanish and English, and now helps her father keep the books for his blacksmith shop. Tommy Wilson, whose grandfather fought in the Civil War, is teaching his younger sister mathematics. Lin Chen, our doctor's daughter, is already reading medical texts and dreams of following in her mother's footsteps. Each child, she mentioned, beamed with pride, sitting up straighter as their names were called. These children had never known a world where their worth was determined by the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth. To them, freedom wasn't something to be fought for. It was simply the natural state of being human. But our success hasn't come without challenges, Mercy said, her tone becoming more serious. There are still people who believe that some children are worth more than others, still voices that tell us to divide ourselves by race or religion or the country where our grandparents were born. She thought about the letter she had received just last month from a group in Phoenix demanding that the school be segregated, that children be separated by race as they were in many other parts of the territory. The letter had been signed by influential people, including some territorial legislators. There are those who say our way of doing things is dangerous, that bringing different kinds of people together will lead to chaos and conflict. But I look out at this room tonight and I see the truth. I see former enemies sitting side by side. I see people who have learned that our differences make us stronger, not weaker. Her eyes found Jacob Henley in the crowd. The transformation in him over the years had been remarkable. The broken, desperate man who had tried to sell her had become someone who genuinely cared about the children in his care. It hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks and struggles, moments when old habits and old thinking tried to reassert themselves. But he had persevered, and now he was living proof that people could change. Jacob Henley, Mercy said, surprising everyone in the room by calling him by name. Would you please stand up? Henley looked startled and embarrassed, but he slowly got to his feet. There were murmurs throughout the crowd as people wondered why Mercy was acknowledging the man who had once tried to sell her. 10 years ago, this man made a terrible mistake, Mercy continued. He was broken by alcohol and desperation, and he tried to trade my freedom for a bottle of whiskey. But since then, he has shown us something beautiful, that people can change. that redemption is possible, that we can choose to become better than we were. The murmurs in the crowd shifted from confusion to understanding. This was what Mercy had always taught, that people's worth wasn't determined by their worst moments, but by their capacity to grow and change. Mr. Henley tends our gardens, maintains our buildings, and watches over our children with the devotion of someone who understands how precious freedom really is. He has earned his place in this community not because we forgot what he did, but because we chose to see who he could become. Henley wiped tears from his eyes as he sat back down. Later, Mercy knew children would run up to him asking about the flowers he was planting or the vegetables growing in the school garden. They would call him Mr. Jacob and bring him drawings they had made in class. To them, he wasn't a man with a shameful past. He was simply part of their world, part of their community. "This is what we've built together," Mercy said, spreading her arms to encompass not just the school but the entire community. A place where people's worth isn't determined by where they came from, but by what they choose to do with their freedom. A place where children can grow up believing that they can become anything they dream of becoming. The applause started slowly but built into a thunderous ovation that seemed to shake the building itself. People were standing, cheering, wiping away tears as they celebrated not just a new school building but everything it represented. As the crowd began to disperse, many people came forward to thank Mercy personally. Parents whose children were learning to read for the first time, young people who had graduated from her first classes and were now teachers and doctors and business owners themselves, visitors from other towns who wanted to start similar schools in their own communities. But the conversation that meant the most to her came from an unexpected source. Dr. Chen approached with her daughter Lynn, a bright 12-year-old who was already reading advanced texts in 3 languages. "Miss Mercy," Lynn said shyly, "I want to be like you when I grow up. I want to start schools and help people learn." Mercy knelt down to be at eye level with the girl. "What do you think is the most important thing for a teacher to remember?" Lynn thought for a moment, her face serious with concentration. "That every student is valuable, no matter what they look like or where they come from." "That's exactly right," Mercy said, giving her a hug. "And if you remember that, you'll be an amazing teacher." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and crimson, Mercy stood on the steps of her school and looked out at the community she had helped build. Children were playing in the street, their laughter mixing with the sounds of evening, horses clip-clopping down the main street, the distant ring of Miguel's hammer in his shop, the gentle chiming of the church bell. Pastor Reynolds joined her on the steps, moving slowly with his cane but still strong in spirit. "Proud of what you've accomplished," he said simply. "We've accomplished," Mercy corrected gently. "None of this would have been possible without you, without all of us working together." "You know," Pastor Reynolds said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about that night in Murphy's saloon, when everything started. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't walked in when I did?" Mercy considered the question. "I think someone else would have stepped forward. Maybe not that night, maybe not in that way, but I believe good people always find a way to stand up for what's right. You didn't save me, Pastor Reynolds. You helped me save myself." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a nightbird called out, its song carrying across the desert air. "What's next?" Pastor Reynolds asked. "You've built this school, educated hundreds of children, changed this whole community. What does Mercy Johnson do for an encore?" Mercy smiled, pulling the wooden bird from her pocket. Its mended wing caught the last rays of sunlight, and for a moment it looked almost alive, almost ready to take flight. "I keep doing what I've always done," she said. "I keep learning, keep growing, keep helping others discover their own worth. Because freedom isn't something you achieve once, and then you're done. It's something you choose every day, something you build and rebuild and share with others." The wooden bird seemed to warm in her hand, and she thought about her mother's words from so long ago. "This bird's gonna fly free someday, just like you will, baby girl." She was free now, free to choose her own path, free to build the life she wanted, free to help others find their own freedom. And in helping others fly free, she had discovered the deepest truth of all, that real freedom came not from being valued by others, but from knowing your own worth and using it to lift up everyone around you. The night was full of possibilities, and Mercy Johnson was ready to embrace them all.